A millionaire dismissed his wife's advice, chose his ambitious secretary over her, and believed his success was untouchable. But when cracks began to appear in his empire, he realized too late that the one person he underestimated most had been quietly planning her own rise. What happened next stunned everyone. The golden glow of the setting sun stretched lazily over the New York skyline, casting long shadows across the sleek marble floors of Richard Thornton's penthouse. From his vantage point, the world below seemed small and distant, a toy city at the mercy of a man who had built his empire with ruthless ambition. The hum of traffic, the scattered blare of horns, and the distant wail of sirens were nothing but background noise to Richard. Sounds that reminded him that life, as chaotic as it could be, was his to conquer. With a glass of scotch in hand, he leaned against the window and admired his reflection. His tailored navy blue suit hugged his athletic frame, the sheen of his silk tie catching the fading light. Everything about Richard Thornton was polished, from the shine on his Italian leather shoes to the way he carried himself with the ease of a man who believed the world owed him nothing, because he had already taken everything he wanted. Behind him, Eleanor Thornton sat at the dining table, her head bent over a stack of financial reports, the tip of her pen tapping rhythmically against the pages. The light framed her figure softly, highlighting the elegant lines of her face. Her black hair, neatly pinned back, contrasted with her cream-colored blouse. She looked every bit the woman who had once been his equal, a partner in both life and business. But lately, Richard barely noticed her presence. To him, she had become another piece of furniture in their pristine penthouse. Always there, reliable, and easily overlooked. Richard, Eleanor's voice broke through the silence, measured and calm. She didn't look up as she spoke, her attention still on the papers spread before her. I was reviewing the projections for tomorrow's presentation. There's a discrepancy in the profit margins you plan to present to the board. Richard sighed audibly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before taking a long sip. I've got it under control, he replied, his voice clipped and dismissive. Eleanor paused, her pen halting mid-tap. She lifted her gaze and studied him carefully, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign that he had truly considered what she said. But Richard's focus was elsewhere, on the glowing screen of his phone, where a message from Samantha Carter had just appeared. Eleanor recognized the look on his face, that faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. She had seen it many times before, back when he was closing deals and outmaneuvering competitors. The only difference now was that the thrill wasn't sparked by business alone. Eleanor cleared her throat softly, as if to pull him back into the conversation. Richard, this isn't about control. The numbers don't add up. If the board questions you, he waved a hand in the air, cutting her off. It's a straightforward deal, Eleanor. Don't overthink it. She exhaled slowly, the weight of his dismissal pressing down on her chest. Years ago, she would have argued, would have stood her ground and forced him to see reason. But she had learned that pushing Richard when he was in one of his moods only drove them further apart. Still, the sting of being brushed aside lingered. All right, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. If you're sure. Richard didn't respond. His attention had already shifted back to his phone, where Samantha had sent another message. I've finalized the presentation. Let's review it over dinner tonight, he smirked, typing a quick response before slipping the phone back into his pocket. I've decided to take Samantha to the meeting tomorrow, he said, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. He didn't look at Eleanor as he spoke, instead focusing on the last sip of his scotch. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her pen, but her expression remained neutral. I see, she replied, her tone unreadable. Richard finally glanced at her, expecting to see a flicker of disappointment or perhaps a quiet plea to reconsider. But Eleanor simply returned to her reports, her composure unsettlingly intact. She didn't protest, didn't remind him of her experience, or the fact that she had been by his side long before Samantha ever entered the picture. Instead, she offered him a small, enigmatic smile. A smile that, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, left him feeling uneasy. Good, he said, trying to mask his discomfort. Samantha understands the kind of high-stakes environment we'll be in tomorrow. Eleanor nodded absently, as if the conversation no longer interested her. "I hope it all goes well for you," she said, her voice light but distant. Richard leaned back against the counter, watching her with a hint of frustration. She wasn't supposed to react like this. He had expected her to argue, to fight for her place at the meeting, to make him feel justified in choosing Samantha over her. But instead, she had left him dangling in the void of her silence. A silence that made him question whether he had truly won this round. As the evening wore on, Richard left the penthouse to meet Samantha at a high-end lounge downtown, the dim lighting and smooth jazz creating an intimate atmosphere that fueled their shared ambitions. Over cocktails and whispered conversations, they reviewed the final details of the presentation, each word laced with the kind of confidence Richard had come to crave. He leaned in, savoring the thrill of the moment, convinced that tomorrow's meeting would be his crowning achievement. Back at the penthouse, Eleanor sat alone by the large bay window, her fingers tracing lazy circles along the rim of her teacup. The city lights glittered like a sea of stars beneath her, but the view offered little comfort. She had spent years building a life with Richard, supporting his dreams while quietly setting aside her own. But tonight, something inside her shifted, a spark of clarity that burned brighter than the city below. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she hadn't called in years. Her thumb hovered over the screen as she debated whether to press dial. But the hesitation lasted only a moment. "Hi," she said when the line connected, her voice steady. "It's been a while. I think I'm ready to discuss that opportunity you mentioned." On the other end, the response was immediate, and Eleanor felt the weight of years of silence begin to lift. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just the woman behind Richard's success. She was the woman about to reclaim her own. Across town, Richard laughed at one of Samantha's jokes, unaware that the balance of power was already shifting beneath his feet. The game had just begun. As Eleanor and Richard sit across from each other, their fates intertwined once more, we can't help but wonder, what would you do in Eleanor's shoes? Would you accept the partnership or leave the past behind for good? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what happens next. The morning sun poured through the massive windows of the penthouse, casting warm golden streaks across the room. Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, sipping her tea as Richard rushed around the kitchen, checking his phone, muttering half-finished sentences to himself, and skimming through emails. His movements were sharp and efficient, like a man on autopilot, driven by the need to stay one step ahead of the world. He adjusted his cufflinks, the sound of the metal clicking faintly in the quiet space. Eleanor's eyes followed him, her gaze calm yet calculating. To anyone else, Richard's morning routine might have seemed like the picture of ambition, a man driven by the relentless pursuit of success. But to Eleanor, it was a glaring display of how much he had changed, how much they had changed. He hadn't even acknowledged her presence this morning beyond a brief nod in her direction. That simple gesture was enough to remind her how easily she had faded into the background of his life. "Make sure the team is ready," Richard barked into his Bluetooth headset, pacing around the island counter. "I don't want any surprises when we present this afternoon." He paused briefly, glancing at his reflection in the glass refrigerator door, adjusting the knot of his silk tie. The image staring back at him was of a man in complete control, or so he believed. He didn't notice the small sigh that escaped Eleanor's lips as she stirred her tea with slow, deliberate motions. "Late night tonight?" she asked, breaking the silence between them. Richard didn't look up. "Probably. Samantha and I need to finalize a few things after the meeting." She nodded, her expression betraying nothing. "I figured." Her tone wasn't bitter or resentful. It was neutral, as if she were merely making an observation. But Richard didn't pick up on the subtlety. He was already typing furiously on his phone, too absorbed in the flow of information to care. Eleanor watched him for a moment longer, memorizing the way he moved, the way he held himself. It wasn't the first time she had observed him like this, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't watching as his wife. She was watching as someone who understood that the only way to outmaneuver Richard Thornton was to know him better than he knew himself. Later that morning, after Richard left for the office, Eleanor sat in the study with her laptop open. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the keys. She scrolled through business articles, reports, and financial forecasts, her mind working faster than it had in years. Somewhere along the way, she had allowed herself to fall into a supporting role, but that part of her was fading quickly, replaced by something far more determined. Her phone vibrated next to her, pulling her attention from the screen. She picked it up and saw the name she had dialed the night before, James Donovan. James had once been a close business associate of Richard's during the early days of their company. Back then, Eleanor had been more than just Richard's wife. She had been his confidant, his advisor, the person who read between the lines and anticipated problems before they surfaced. James had always admired her for that, often saying she had a sharper mind than most of the executives they worked with. But as the years passed and Richard's ego inflated, Eleanor had found herself pushed further into the shadows. Now, however, she was ready to step back into the light. "Good morning, Eleanor," James said when she answered, his voice warm and familiar. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you after all this time. I wasn't expecting to call," she admitted, leaning back in her chair. "But things have changed." There was a pause on the other end of the line before James spoke again. "Changed how?" Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say I'm no longer content to sit on the sidelines. I've been watching Richard's moves for a long time, and I think it's time I make a few of my own." James chuckled softly. "I always knew you had it in you. What are you thinking?" She glanced at the financial projections on her screen, the numbers dancing in her mind as she visualized the path forward. "I have a proposal," she said confidently, "one that could be mutually beneficial for both of us." James didn't hesitate. "I'm listening." For the next hour, they discussed her vision, a plan that would take advantage of Richard's blind spots and build something sustainable, something lasting. Unlike Richard's aggressive, short-term strategies, Eleanor's approach was rooted in patience and long-term growth. By the time the call ended, James had agreed to meet with her in person to iron out the details. As she set the phone down, Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline rush through her veins. It wasn't just about the deal. It was about reclaiming a part of herself that she had buried beneath years of compromise and silence. She wasn't just Richard's wife anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, across town, Richard was in the middle of a strategy meeting with Samantha. The boardroom was filled with sleek leather chairs, glass walls, and the faint hum of a projector displaying slides of financial forecasts. Samantha stood at the front of the room, her sharp pencil skirt and fitted blazer emphasizing her confidence as she spoke with precision. "We need to highlight the projected growth in emerging markets," she said, clicking to the next slide. "That's where the board will see the most value." Richard nodded, but his mind wandered for a moment. He had always been drawn to people who exuded ambition, and Samantha embodied that perfectly. But something about today's presentation didn't sit right with him. It wasn't that Samantha had done anything wrong. She was thorough, prepared, and knew how to sell an idea. But Richard felt a nagging sensation in the back of his mind, like he was missing something important. He brushed the thought aside. They had come too far to second-guess themselves now. "Everything looks good," he said, giving Samantha a reassuring smile. "This is exactly what the board wants to see." Samantha returned the smile, her eyes glinting with determination. "We've got this, Richard." But as the meeting continued, that nagging doubt remained, buried just beneath the surface. Back at the penthouse, Eleanor closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had spent years observing Richard, studying his habits, his patterns, and the way he approached business. And now, she was using that knowledge to her advantage. The game had officially begun, and for the first time, Eleanor wasn't just a spectator. She was a player. When Richard returned home that evening, he found Eleanor in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book in her lap. She looked up briefly and offered him a small smile before returning to her reading. "How was the meeting?" she asked casually, as if it were just another ordinary day. Richard shrugged, loosening his tie. "Good. Productive." Eleanor nodded, hiding the flicker of satisfaction that threatened to surface. She knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in Richard's plans began to show, and when they did, she would be ready. For now, She would remain the silent observer, watching and waiting as the pieces of her plan slowly fell into place. The conference room of Thornton Enterprises buzzed with muted anticipation, a symphony of murmurs, the rustling of papers, and the faint hum of the projector as it displayed financial charts on the glass walls. Richard Thornton stood at the head of the sleek mahogany table, radiating confidence in his tailored navy suit. Beside him, Samantha Carter flipped through a leather-bound portfolio, her polished nails tapping against the pages with the precision of someone who had meticulously prepared for this moment. It was a room filled with power, board members in tailored suits, silver-haired executives who had built empires, and young analysts eager to prove themselves. Richard thrived in environments like this. He understood the nuances of boardroom dynamics, the subtle glances exchanged between colleagues, the way a slight nod could signify approval or dissent. Today, he believed, would be another victory added to his long list of accomplishments. "Thank you all for being here," Richard began, his voice smooth and commanding. "We're at a pivotal moment for this company. Today's presentation will outline how we'll leverage market trends and emerging technologies to dominate the industry." Samantha took over seamlessly, clicking to the first slide of the presentation. She spoke with conviction, her words flowing effortlessly as she highlighted projected revenue growth, market expansion strategies, and key partnerships. The board members nodded along, their pens scratching against notepads, their faces a mix of intrigue and measured approval. But halfway through the presentation, something shifted. One of the senior board members, an older man with a weathered face and a reputation for asking difficult questions, leaned forward, his gaze narrowing as he studied the data on the screen. "Richard," he said, interrupting Samantha mid-sentence, "these growth projections are impressive, but I'm concerned about the risk factors. You're proposing rapid expansion, but what safeguards are in place if the market doesn't respond as expected?" The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard felt a flicker of irritation. He hadn't anticipated this level of scrutiny so early in the presentation. He adjusted his tie and offered the board member a practiced smile. "That's a fair question," he said, his tone measured. "We've accounted for potential risks by diversifying our investments across multiple sectors. If one market underperforms, the others will offset the impact." The older man didn't seem convinced. He exchanged a glance with a woman seated across from him, a sharp-eyed executive who had built her reputation by identifying flaws in high-stakes proposals. "I don't see a detailed contingency plan in the materials you've provided," she said, flipping through the documents in front of her. "What happens if we face a significant downturn in the market? How quickly can we pivot without incurring major losses?" Samantha's polished confidence faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "We've built flexibility into our financial model," she explained, gesturing to the next slide. "Our financing structure allows us to adjust our strategy based on market conditions." The woman tapped her pen against the table, her gaze unwavering. "Flexibility is important, but it's not a substitute for a well-defined risk management strategy. We need more than just projections. We need a plan." Richard's smile tightened as he felt the room's energy shift. The board members, who had initially been receptive, now looked skeptical. Their expressions were subtle but unmistakable. Raised eyebrows, crossed arms, furtive glances exchanged between colleagues. Doubt was spreading, and Richard knew that once it took hold, it was difficult to reverse. "We've spent months analyzing market trends," Richard said, his voice firm but with an edge of defensiveness. "Our projections are based on comprehensive data. We're confident that our approach is the right one." But the doubt lingered, festering beneath the surface like a slow-moving current. Richard could feel it slipping away. The control he had taken for granted, the certainty that this presentation would be a success. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor Thornton sat in a sunlit cafe, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. The air smelled of freshly baked pastries and roasted coffee beans, but Eleanor's mind was elsewhere, focused on the conversation unfolding across the table. James Donovan leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of thoughtful gaze that made her feel both seen and understood. "I have to say," James said, swirling his coffee, "your proposal is one of the most well-thought-out plans I've seen in a while. It's not flashy, but it's solid." Exactly what the market needs right now. Eleanor smiled, a small but genuine expression that hinted at the quiet confidence she had been nurturing for months. That's exactly what I was aiming for. I'm not interested in short-term gains. I want something sustainable. James nodded, tapping a finger against the folder she had given him. This deal has the potential to outshine anything Richard's working on. You know that, right? I know, she replied, her voice steady. But it's not about outshining him. It's about proving to myself that I can do this. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. And when you do, what then? Eleanor took a sip of her tea, her gaze drifting to the bustling street outside. Then I keep moving forward. As the conversation continued, Eleanor's phone vibrated against the table. She glanced at the screen and saw a notification from a financial news outlet. Thornton Enterprises faces tough questions during high-stakes presentation. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she locked the phone and slipped it back into her bag. She didn't need to read the article to know what was happening. She had anticipated this moment, had known that Richard's aggressive approach would eventually catch up to him. Back in the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to strained. The board members were no longer nodding along. They were questioning, probing, and dissecting every aspect of the proposal. Samantha tried to steer the conversation back on track, but the momentum was gone. Richard's jaw clenched as he struggled to maintain his composure. This was supposed to be his moment, the culmination of months of planning and late nights. But instead, it was unraveling before his eyes. "Thank you for your feedback," he said finally, his voice tight. "We'll take your concerns into consideration and make the necessary adjustments." The meeting ended with polite handshakes and forced smiles, but Richard knew the damage had been done. As he and Samantha left the conference room, she turned to him, her brow furrowed with frustration. "We need to regroup," she said. "They weren't buying it." "I know," Richard muttered, loosening his tie as they walked down the corridor. "We'll figure it out." But as he stepped into the elevator, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't just a setback, it was a warning. He had built his success on the belief that he could predict every outcome, control every variable. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was still ahead of the game. Across town, Eleanor walked out of the cafe, the crisp autumn air brushing against her cheeks. She felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years, as if the weight of her past decisions had finally lifted. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to James. "Let's move forward with phase 1 of the plan. I'm ready." As she slipped her phone back into her bag, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The turning point had arrived, and this time, she wasn't just a spectator. She was the one setting the course. The game was shifting, and Eleanor Thornton was ready to play. The steady hum of the city filled the air as the elevator doors slid open, and Richard Thornton stepped into his penthouse with the weight of the day pressing down on him. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing faintly in the vast silence of the room. The smell of leather and wood polish, normally comforting, now felt suffocating. The evening light filtered through the towering glass windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch infinitely, much like the doubts swirling in his mind. He loosened his tie and exhaled heavily, tossing his briefcase onto the sleek leather couch. The board meeting had been a disaster, and the memory of the pointed questions, the skeptical glances, and the heavy silence that followed Samantha's final pitch gnawed at him like an open wound. For years, he had been the man who commanded boardrooms with ease, the one whose proposals were met with admiration and swift approval. But today had been different. Today, the cracks in his empire had shown, and he wasn't sure how to seal them. "Rough day?" Eleanor's voice drifted from the kitchen, soft yet piercing in its precision. Richard turned toward her, surprised to see her standing at the counter, slicing vegetables with the kind of calm efficiency that made him feel even more off balance. She wore a simple black dress, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders, and her eyes, those eyes that once held admiration for him, were now unreadable. "You could say that," he replied, running a hand through his hair. He waited for her to press for details, to ask about the meeting, but she simply continued slicing, the rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board filling the silence. "Dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes, she said without looking up. "If you're hungry." He frowned slightly, unsettled by her composure. Normally, she would have asked him about the presentation, offered suggestions, or at least made a comment about his workload. But tonight, she was distant, detached, as if she had already moved on from whatever had once tied them together. "Did you hear anything about the meeting?" he asked, testing the waters. Eleanor paused briefly, the knife hovering above a bright red pepper, before resuming her task. "I saw a headline," she admitted. "It mentioned that the board had concerns about your proposal." Richard's jaw tightened. Concerns is an understatement. Eleanor set the knife down and turned to face him, wiping her hands on a towel. "What happened?" He hesitated, debating whether to share the details. But something about the way she stood there, calm and composed, made him feel vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. "They questioned the risk management plan, or the lack of one," he admitted. Samantha tried to salvage it, but it was clear they weren't convinced. Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "You've always been good at selling ambition, Richard. But ambition without caution can be risky." He bristled at her words, even though he knew they were true. "I don't need a lecture right now, Eleanor." "I wasn't giving you one," she replied softly. "Just an observation." An awkward silence settled between them, and Richard shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He felt as if she could see through the carefully constructed facade he had built over the years, peeling back the layers to expose the insecurity he worked so hard to hide. "I'm handling it," he said finally, as if saying the words out loud would make them true. "I'm sure you are," she said, her tone unreadable. As she turned back to the cutting board, Richard watched her with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Something about her had changed recently, and he couldn't put his finger on it. She was no longer the woman who quietly accepted his decisions or waited for him to share details of his day. There was an air of independence about her now, a quiet strength that made him feel as though she was slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. After dinner, Richard retreated to his study, the glow of his desk lamp casting a pool of light over the scattered papers and financial reports. He leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his temples as he replayed the board meeting in his mind. The doubts, the criticisms, the way his usual charm had failed to sway them. It all felt like a ticking time bomb threatening to explode. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Eleanor standing in the doorway, a cup of tea in her hands. She stepped inside and placed the cup on his desk before sitting across from him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You used to ask for my advice," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Richard exhaled sharply. "That was a long time ago. Maybe it's time you start again." He stared at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. Part of him wanted to push her away, to protect his pride and convince himself that he didn't need anyone's help. But another part, the part that remembered how instrumental she had been in the early days of his success, knew that she was right. "What would you suggest?" he asked reluctantly, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "You're focusing too much on expansion without considering sustainability. The board sees that, and it makes them nervous. You need to show them that you're thinking long-term, not just about short-term wins." He nodded slowly, her advice resonating with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. "And how do I do that?" "By admitting where you went wrong and presenting a revised plan that addresses their concerns," she said. "They don't expect you to be perfect, Richard. They expect you to be adaptable." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline he wasn't sure he deserved but knew he needed. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of the partnership they once shared. A partnership built on trust, respect, and mutual ambition. "Thank you," he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice surprising even himself. Eleanor smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "I hope you mean that." Before he could respond, she stood and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He stared at the cup of tea she had left on his desk, the steam curling upward like a fragile thread connecting the past to the present. He had spent so long chasing success that he hadn't realized how much he had left behind. Across town, in a private office suite, Eleanor sat with James Donovan, finalizing the details of their partnership. The room was quiet except for the sound of pins scratching against paper and the soft hum of the air conditioning. "This is a solid plan," James said, signing the final document. "Once we launch, there's no going back." Eleanor nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I'm ready." As they shook hands, Eleanor felt a sense of closure and anticipation intertwine within her. The woman who had once been defined by her husband's success was now standing firmly on her own. And as she left the office that night, the cool evening air brushing against her skin, she knew that the sands had shifted. Back at the penthouse, Richard sat in his study, staring at the empty doorway where Eleanor had stood just moments ago. The silence of the room was deafening, and for the first time, he felt the weight of what he stood to lose. Not just his business, but the woman who had been his greatest asset all along. And as the night stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him was slipping faster than he could catch it. The morning light filtered through the glass walls of Thornton Enterprises, casting reflections of the bustling city beyond. Inside the office, however, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The hum of voices, the hurried footsteps, and the rapid clacking of keyboards created a symphony of tension. Richard Thornton stood at the center of the chaos, a phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders to a junior associate. "I don't care what excuses they're giving," he said sharply. "Find a way to get them back on board." He ended the call abruptly and turned toward Samantha Carter, who stood by the conference table, flipping through a thick binder filled with financial documents. Her sleek, tailored blazer and pencil skirt were immaculate, but the faint crease in her brow betrayed her frustration. "They're pulling out," Samantha said, her voice low but steady. "Investor confidence is slipping, and it's spreading." Richard clenched his jaw, pacing the room like a caged animal. "What do they want? We've shown them the numbers. The growth potential is undeniable." "They're not questioning the numbers," Samantha replied. "They're questioning you." The statement hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. "What do you mean they're questioning me?" Samantha hesitated, then sighed. "They're saying you've lost your edge. That Eleanor's success has thrown you off balance." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He had built his reputation on being the man who was always one step ahead, the visionary who could see opportunities before anyone else. But now, the very investors who once praised his foresight were doubting him, and it was because of Eleanor. "She's not a threat," Richard said, more to himself than to Samantha. "She's just riding the wave of one successful deal." Samantha crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "One deal is all it takes if it's the right one." Richard wanted to argue, to dismiss Samantha's words as an overreaction, but deep down, he knew she was right. Eleanor's deal with James Donovan had sent ripples through the industry, and those ripples were quickly turning into waves. Investors were watching her now, and they weren't just impressed. They were shifting their allegiance. "Have you tried to reach out to any of the investors directly?" Samantha asked, her tone softening. Richard nodded. "I've called a few of them. They're polite, but non-committal. They keep mentioning Eleanor's proposal as if it's the gold standard." Samantha tapped her fingers against the table, thinking, "We need to act fast. If we don't counter her momentum, she's going to gain even more ground." Richard exhaled slowly, his mind racing. For years, he had been the one leading the charge, setting the pace. Now, for the first time, he was on the defensive, scrambling to keep up. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor Thornton stood in the center of a sunlit boardroom, addressing a group of investors with the kind of poise and confidence that came naturally to her now. The large windows behind her framed the city skyline, but her focus was entirely on the room in front of her. "Phase 1 of our expansion has exceeded projections," she said, clicking to the next slide of her presentation. "We're already seeing early returns that validate our approach, and with the additional funding, we can scale even faster." The investors leaned forward, nodding in approval as they reviewed the charts and graphs on the screen. James Donovan sat at the head of the table, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Eleanor had proven herself beyond his expectations, and he was proud to be part of her journey. "What about long-term sustainability?" one of the investors asked. How do you plan to maintain growth without overextending? Eleanor smiled, prepared for the question. We've built flexibility into our model. Unlike traditional aggressive expansions, we're prioritizing scalable growth. If the market shifts, we can pivot without compromising our core assets. James leaned in, adding his own endorsement. Eleanor's strategy isn't just about growth, it's about stability. That's what makes this project unique. The investor nodded, satisfied with the answer. As the meeting continued, Eleanor felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced before. This wasn't just about proving Richard wrong. It was about proving to herself that she could thrive on her own terms. After the meeting, James walked her to the elevator, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. "You've got them wrapped around your finger," he said with a grin. "I don't think they've ever been this enthusiastic about a project." Eleanor laughed softly. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still work to be done." "True," James agreed. "But you've already won half the battle." Richard scrambling to keep up. The mention of Richard caused a flicker of emotion to cross Eleanor's face, but she quickly masked it. "He's resourceful," she said. "He'll find a way to fight back." James studied her carefully. "Does that bother you?" She hesitated before answering. "It doesn't bother me, but it reminds me that we're not just competing in business. We're unraveling years of partnership." James nodded thoughtfully. "Do you regret any of it?" Eleanor's gaze softened, and for a moment, she allowed herself to reflect on the life she had shared with Richard. The highs, the lows, the dreams they had built together before things fell apart. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret the past, but I won't let it define my future." As the elevator doors closed, Eleanor took a deep breath. She had made her choice, and she was determined to see it through. Back at Thornton Enterprises, Richard stood in his office, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in hues of orange and gold. The day had been a whirlwind of phone calls, strategy meetings, and damage control, but he still felt like he was treading water. Samantha entered the room quietly, holding a folder filled with updated financial projections. "I've reviewed our options," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "We can implement a more aggressive marketing campaign to regain investor confidence. It's risky, but it might be our best shot." Richard rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Aggressive isn't the answer," he muttered. "That's how we got into this mess." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Then what's the plan?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he thought about Eleanor, about her calm, measured approach, her ability to see angles he had missed. She had always been the voice of reason, the one who balanced his ambition with caution. And now, she was using those same qualities to outmaneuver him. "I don't know yet," he admitted, the words tasting bitter. "But I can't keep fighting her head-on. I need to rethink everything." Samantha's expression softened, and for the first time that day, she seemed unsure of what to say. "Richard," she began, her voice gentle, "it's okay to admit you need help." He met her gaze, the vulnerability in his eyes undeniable. "I don't just need help," he said quietly. "I need to understand where I went wrong." As the city lights flickered to life outside, Richard knew that the world around him was shifting faster than he could control. Eleanor had built something powerful, and if he didn't adapt, he would be left behind. But for the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to beat her. He was thinking about how to survive in a world where she no longer needed him. Richard Thornton sat in the dim glow of his office, the flicker of the city's lights casting distorted reflections across the glass walls. Outside, the rhythmic pulse of New York continued without pause, a reminder of a world that wouldn't stop just because he was spiraling. His fingers drummed against the edge of his desk, the soft tapping the only sound in the otherwise silent room. The faint aroma of the whiskey swirling in his glass mixed with the scent of leather and mahogany, a combination that once symbolized power but now felt suffocating. He stared at the papers spread across the desk, the numbers blurring as his mind raced. The latest financial reports showed a steep decline in investor confidence, and Eleanor's name was mentioned repeatedly in every article he had read that day. She wasn't just succeeding, she was thriving, building something monumental while his empire teetered on the edge. The door creaked open, and Samantha entered quietly, a tablet in hand. She paused when she saw him, her usually confident demeanor softening. "I figured you'd still be here," she said, closing the door behind her. "Have you eaten anything today?" Richard shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the papers. "Not hungry." Samantha sighed and placed the tablet on the desk. "I've been reviewing the latest developments. Eleanor's company just secured another major investor." Richard exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the news settling heavily on his chest. "Which one?" "Charles Livingston," Samantha replied. "He was one of ours. Well, he used to be." Richard laughed bitterly. "Of course he was." Samantha hesitated before speaking again. They're calling her strategy the perfect balance of ambition and caution. She flipped through the data on her tablet. Her projections are outperforming ours by a significant margin. "If we don't make a move soon, there's no move to make," Richard interrupted, his voice cold. He set the whiskey glass down with a thud and rubbed his temples. "She's outplayed us." Samantha frowned, leaning forward. "Are you giving up?" Richard's gaze hardened. "No. I'm acknowledging that she saw the flaws in my plan before I did. She spent years watching, learning, and waiting. And now, she's proving what I should have known all along. She's better at this than I ever gave her credit for." Samantha fell silent, unsure of how to respond. She had always seen Richard as unshakable, the man who could navigate any crisis with unwavering confidence. But tonight, he seemed different, less like a titan of industry and more like a man grappling with the consequences of his own blindness. "Maybe you need to talk to her," Samantha suggested carefully. Richard scoffed. "Talk to her? And say what? Congratulations on dismantling everything I built?" "Maybe," Samantha said softly. "Or maybe you could figure out where you two went wrong." The suggestion lingered in the air, and for a moment, Richard considered it. But before he could respond, Samantha's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. She checked the screen, her expression shifting to one of discomfort. "It's an update from the PR team," she said. "They're advising damage control. Eleanor's team just released a statement highlighting their market dominance." Richard waved her off. "Handle it. I'm done for the night." Samantha hesitated, then nodded and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. As the silence enveloped him, Richard leaned forward and rested his elbows on the desk, his head in his hands. Memories flooded his mind. Late nights spent strategizing with Eleanor, the way she used to anticipate risks he hadn't even considered, the way her presence had once been his greatest asset. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped listening to her. He had dismissed her insights, convinced that his ambition was enough to carry them both. He reached for his phone and scrolled through their old messages, stopping at one from years ago. "I trust you to make the right decision, but don't forget to consider the long-term impact." It was a simple message, but it encapsulated everything he had ignored. Eleanor had always been thinking long-term, while he had been chasing short-term victories. His fingers hovered over her name in his contacts, but he didn't press call. Instead, he set the phone down and stared out the window, the weight of regret pressing down on him like an anchor. Across town, Eleanor sat in her home office, reviewing a stack of documents while the faint hum of jazz played in the background. The room was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere of Richard's office. A soft knock on the door pulled her attention, and she looked up to see James Donovan standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a break," James said, walking in and setting one of the cups on her desk. Eleanor smiled gratefully and took a sip. "Thanks. It's been a long day." "I can imagine," James said, taking a seat across from her. "But you're handling it beautifully. The investors are thrilled, and the press can't get enough of you." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Let's hope it stays that way." James studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've come a long way, Eleanor. Do you ever think about how different things would be if you and Richard had stayed on the same path?" She set the coffee cup down and exhaled slowly. "I do," she admitted. "But then I remind myself that we weren't on the same path. He was running toward something, and I was standing still, waiting for him to notice I was right there beside him. And now, I'm moving forward on my own terms." James nodded, a hint of admiration in his gaze. "You deserve it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past slowly giving way to the promise of the future. But even as Eleanor immersed herself in her new life, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if Richard was finally beginning to see what he had missed. Back at the penthouse, Richard stood by the window, the city's glow reflecting off the glass. He had always believed that success was measured by control, by the ability to bend the world to his will. But tonight, he realized that true success wasn't about control. It was about understanding the value of the people around you. He poured himself another glass of whiskey and sat down, the weight of his regret pressing against him like a heavy fog. Eleanor had been his greatest ally, and he had let her slip through his fingers. Now, she was thriving, and he was left to pick up the pieces. As the night stretched on, Richard knew that the only way forward was to confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long. He had underestimated Eleanor, and it had cost him everything. The warm glow of the afternoon sun poured through the glass walls of the Donovan Investments office, casting elongated shadows across the boardroom. Eleanor Thornton sat at the head of the polished wooden table, her presence commanding yet graceful. She was dressed in a sleek navy blue suit, her hair cascading neatly over her shoulders, and a small gold watch glinted on her wrist. Every detail of her appearance was deliberate, exuding power without excess. Across from her, James Donovan leaned back in his chair, casually observing the other executives as they reviewed the latest financial projections. The room buzzed with quiet excitement as they flipped through the neatly bound reports. It had only been a few months since Eleanor had launched her venture, but the results were already turning heads in the corporate world. "This growth rate is exceptional," one of the investors said, tapping his pen against the graph in front of him. "I can't remember the last time I saw projections this promising actually being exceeded." Eleanor smiled faintly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. "It's about consistency," she said. "We've built a model that prioritizes stability over risky expansions. The key is to grow without outpacing ourselves." James chimed in, a glint of pride in his eyes. "And it's working better than we anticipated. We've attracted attention from key industry players who want in." Eleanor nodded, but her mind wandered briefly as the conversation continued around her. She had anticipated success. She had meticulously planned for it. But experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. The accolades, the respect, the partnerships. These were things Richard had once monopolized while she remained in the shadows. Now, the spotlight was firmly on her. Her phone buzzed softly, vibrating against the table. She glanced down and saw Richard's name flashing on the screen. For a moment, she debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. With a quiet excuse, she rose from the table and stepped out onto the private balcony, the cool breeze offering a brief respite from the intensity of the meeting. She answered the call. "Richard." There was a brief pause before he spoke. His voice was calm but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or desperation. "I thought it was time we talked." Eleanor leaned against the railing, her gaze drifting across the skyline. "What about?" "Everything," he said softly. "The business, us, the choices we've made." She exhaled, the sound carried away by the wind. "I don't know if there's much left to say." "There is," Richard insisted. "Please, just hear me out." There was a time when Eleanor would have dropped everything to listen, to be the understanding wife who put Richard's needs above her own. But that time had passed. "I'm listening," she said, but her tone was guarded. "I underestimated you," he admitted, the vulnerability in his voice cutting through the distance between them. "Not just as my wife, but as someone who was always capable of more than I gave you credit for." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of his words settle over her. She had waited years to hear something like this, but now that it had come, it felt bittersweet. "I'm not calling to make excuses," Richard continued. "I know I messed up. I know I pushed you aside when I should have been listening to you. And now, seeing what you've accomplished, it's made me realize how much I relied on you without ever acknowledging it." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the railing. "And what do you want from me now, Richard? An apology from me for succeeding without you? A second chance to make things right?" "No," he said quickly. I don't want you to apologize for anything. I want to learn from this. I want to understand where I went wrong and how to move forward, whether that's with you or without you." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "I spent years waiting for you to see me as an equal," she said, her voice steady. "And when you didn't, I decided to stop waiting." "I see that now," Richard said quietly. "I see everything now. But it's too late, isn't it?" The silence between them was heavy, the kind that held years of unspoken emotions. Eleanor could hear the sincerity in his voice, the regret that came from realizing something too late. But she had built her life around waiting for Richard to change, and she wasn't willing to do that anymore. "It's not about whether it's too late," she said after a long pause. "It's about what I want now. And what I want is to keep building what I've started." "I understand," Richard replied, though the weight of the words seemed to crush him. "But I don't want to be your competition." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You were never my competition, Richard. You were just my beginning." Before he could respond, she ended the call and took a deep breath. The weight she had carried for years lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of closure. She wasn't angry anymore, and she didn't feel the need for revenge. She had proven to herself what she needed to, and that was enough. When she returned to the boardroom, James raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Yes," she said, taking her seat. "Everything's exactly as it should be." Across town, Richard sat in his office, staring out at the city below. The phone call had been harder than he'd expected, but it had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: clarity. He had built his life around control, around the belief that he could bend the world to his will. But Eleanor had shown him that control wasn't the same as understanding. The door to his office opened, and Samantha stepped in, her arms full of folders. "We've compiled a new strategy," she said, placing the documents on his desk. "It's aggressive, but it might be what we need to win back investor confidence." Richard glanced at the folders, but didn't reach for them. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "I don't think aggression is the answer anymore." Samantha frowned, clearly confused. "Then what is?" Richard stood and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets. "Adaptation, flexibility, long-term thinking." Samantha stared at him for a moment before nodding. "I can work with that." As she left the office, Richard remained by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to admit that he didn't have all the answers. Eleanor had taught him that much. The phone on his desk buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It wasn't Eleanor. It was one of the investors who had recently distanced themselves from his company. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the phone and answered. "Let's talk," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Because while he couldn't change the past, he could change what came next. The sound of rain pattering against the wide glass windows filled the silence in the room. Richard Thornton sat at the long conference table in his office, the dim glow of the overhead lights casting shadows across the papers spread before him. The once towering confidence he carried into every meeting had dwindled to a faint hum. He tapped a pen against the table absent-mindedly, his gaze distant as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. The day had been long. Another series of investor calls, damage control with the press, and an emergency meeting with his executive team to discuss next steps. But no matter how many strategies they outlined or how many scenarios they simulated, the truth remained the same. Eleanor's company had gained a stranglehold on the market, and they weren't letting go. Samantha Carter entered the room quietly, a thick binder tucked under her arm. Her normally sharp demeanor had softened over the past few weeks, as if the weight of their declining position had worn her down. She placed the binder in front of Richard and took the seat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "These are the final recommendations from the team," she said, her voice steady but lacking its usual edge. "They've identified a few potential avenues for recovery." Richard flipped through the pages slowly, scanning the bullet points and charts without fully processing them. "Let me guess," he said, his tone dry. "More aggressive marketing, tighter cost control, and a PR campaign to restore investor confidence." Samantha nodded, though she seemed just as unconvinced as he was. "It's the standard playbook." He leaned back in his chair and sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Standard isn't going to work." Not this time. Samantha studied him carefully, her brow furrowing. Then what will? Richard set the binder aside and stood, pacing toward the window. The city lights shimmered through the rain, creating a kaleidoscope of color on the wet pavement below. He had always loved this view, the way it made him feel as if he were on top of the world. But tonight, it felt more like a reminder of everything he was on the verge of losing. I spent so many years thinking that success meant being in control, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That if I could control the narrative, the market, and the people around me, I'd win. Samantha tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. But Eleanor never tried to control anything, Richard continued. She adapted. She watched, learned, and positioned herself perfectly. And now, she's everything I thought I was supposed to be. He turned to face Samantha, his expression somber. We can't win this by playing the same game. So what's the alternative? She asked, leaning forward slightly. Richard walked back to the table and sat down, his gaze locking onto hers. We collaborate. Samantha blinked, taken aback. With Eleanor? Yes, he said firmly. She's not just beating us because she's good at business. She's beating us because she understands what I refuse to see. That the world is changing, and we have to change with it. Samantha leaned back in her chair, processing his words. And you think she'll agree to that? After everything? Richard hesitated, the memory of their last conversation playing in his mind. The vulnerability in her voice, the quiet strength with which she had set her boundaries. It had been a moment of reckoning for him. He knew Eleanor wasn't someone who could be swayed easily, but he also knew that she wasn't driven by revenge. She had built her success on something far more powerful, vision. I don't know if she'll agree, he admitted, but I have to try. The next morning, Richard arrived at Eleanor's office building, a sleek high-rise in the heart of the city. The lobby buzzed with activity, executives and assistants rushing from one meeting to the next, their heels clicking against the marble floor. As he approached the reception desk, he couldn't help but feel the weight of how far they had both come since the early days of their marriage. I have a meeting with Eleanor Thornton, he told the receptionist. She checked her schedule and nodded. Miss Thornton is expecting you. Take the elevator to the 25th floor. As he rode the elevator, Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had prepared for countless negotiations, but this felt different. It wasn't just about business. It was about acknowledging the mistakes that had led them here and hoping that Eleanor was willing to give him a chance to fix things. When the elevator doors opened, he was greeted by a spacious, modern office filled with natural light. Eleanor stood near the large windows, her back to him, gazing out at the city. She wore a tailored white blazer over a soft beige blouse, her presence as commanding as ever. Richard, she said without turning around. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. He stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. I wasn't sure you'd let me. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. What do you want? He took a moment to gather his thoughts, his gaze meeting hers. I want to work with you. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by skepticism. Work with me? After everything? I know it sounds crazy, Richard admitted, taking a step closer. But you've built something incredible, something that I can't ignore. And I'm not here to take it from you. I'm here to be a part of it. Eleanor crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. Why now? Because I've realized that control isn't the answer, he said. Collaboration is. You've always understood that better than I have. And I'm finally ready to admit that I need you. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any signs of deception. But what she saw was genuine. Regret, humility, and a willingness to change. I don't need you to succeed, Richard, she said quietly. I know, he replied, but maybe we can succeed together. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of years of history and unspoken emotions. Finally, Eleanor exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I'm willing to hear you out, but this isn't about fixing the past. It's about building something new. Richard nodded. I wouldn't expect anything less. They sat down at the small conference table near the window, the city sprawling beneath them like a living, breathing entity. As they began to discuss the details of a potential partnership, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Eleanor wasn't just offering him a lifeline. She was offering him a chance to redefine what success meant. And for the first time, he realized that success didn't have to come at the expense of the people who mattered most. As they shook hands at the end of the meeting, Eleanor met his gaze with a look that was equal parts caution and trust. "Don't make me regret this," she said. "I won't," Richard promised. And as he left her office, stepping out into the cool morning air, he felt a sense of renewal wash over him. The game had changed, but this time, he wasn't playing to win. He was playing to grow. And that made all the difference.